Tenang telah membawa resah, resah telah membawa kau kemari. Tapi kamarmu bukan di sini dan kau merantau lagi. The calm has brought the storm. The storm has brought you here, but your room is not here, and you wonder once again. Welcome to Norse Nusantara, where I bring you voices in art and living heritage that define and disrupt ideas about the Nusantara, the world's largest archipelago. Welcome to the show, Stephen. I'm so thrilled to have you to talk about picturing the Nusantara. You know, we have known each other since you were the senior curator at the Asian Civilisations Museum. And I've always respected your work that constantly pushed the envelope on new discoveries of the ancient world of the region. And it's so rare to have a chance to speak to an archaeologist who is also a curator and educator. So I truly value your insights on the archaeological richness of the region that could help us understand present-day cultural landscape of the Nusantara. How about we start by inviting you to introduce yourself and your work?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, first of all, Noor, for inviting me onto this podcast. Yeah, it's a great opportunity. It's always really nice to have the chance to talk about your work and to have a sort of hopefully a quite in-depth and engaged discussion about it. Yeah. Presently I am a senior lecturer at SOAS, University of London. I have quite a long title. It's called the Pratap Pal Senior Lecturer in Curating and Museology of Asian Art. So essentially, I've been quite lucky because I can take both the museums, the professional experience I've had through 9 years working in museums, and combine that with my area of sort of subject specialization, which is Southeast Asian archaeology. So I get to teach and do research on both. So it's a really nice position, really nice post that I'm in that allows me to combine both, I guess, both hats that I've worn throughout my career. So yeah, that's where I am at present.
Okay. And tell us about your interesting project with the Getty on restitution.
Right. So actually, this project is exactly what I've just said. It allows me to. So when I came back to SOAS, and of course, as an academic, I was thinking, okay, what direction do I want to go in now in terms of my research, and how can I combine these two strands? So I was very lucky that myself. So I'm the co-I on this, which in academic speech is I'm the co-investigator, and then my colleague, Professor Ashley Thompson, who's also a Southeast Asia specialist, she focuses primarily on Cambodia. I focus on Thailand. So it's a really good match. So she's the principal investigator. So the two of us run this project where we've got it's part of the Getty Foundation, call it Connecting Art History Grants. And you bring a team of people together focused on a specific question, and it has to combine sort of international scholarship with in-region expertise. So we put a pitch together to look at restitution and repatriation in Southeast Asia, because so much has happened over the past 15 years in terms of objects going back, particularly to Indonesia. I think you've seen a lot of that, Cambodia as well, and Thailand as well. So this project allows us to bring scholars we have scholars from Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia. Unfortunately, we don't have any from Myanmar at present. We have two Singaporeans. So yeah, we have a good coverage, and then we have international scholars like myself and Ashley who are running it. But then we have a museum curator from Asian Art San Francisco. We have a professor from Leiden. And am I leaving anybody out? I hope, hopefully not. We have an artist, a British Singaporean artist, Erica Tan, who's also part of it to bring in a different perspective, which is which is really great because it challenges, it forces us out of our quite, narrow I go into archaeology mode very quickly, and so that's helpful. And we have a Thai contemporary scholar as well, Kenji. So again, we have a nice balance of people that do sort of more sort of our history archaeology. We have certain people who are working much more within ministries or within museums in region. And we really just try to, because this has all happened so quickly, and of course, there's a lot in the media about it. The media love it. It's a kind of interesting, it takes Indiana
up so
Jones,
much.
kind of all this sort of, Thomas Crown affair, whatever, and that's good. It's great. It's getting media attention. But of course, the media can sensationalize things, and there's certain narratives at play as well. And so we wanted this gives us a space to really think through these issues and to move maybe beyond quite simple narratives of sort of nation state versus big American museum, for example, or sort of, how do we actually think about what's happening in this moment more critically and reflect on it, and who are the different stakeholders at play, whose voices are getting heard, whose voices are getting pushed to one side, right? And what are sort of power dynamics, and also what happens. For me, I'm very interested what happens when these pieces go back, right? So
it's a very complex issue.
Yeah, because the media then sort of, once the returns take place, the media sort of disappears. But then there's all these issues, like they call them restitutions, but usually an object that's been stolen from a temple, it doesn't go back to the original temple, it goes back to a national museum. So again, there's internal power dynamics at play as well that are quite important to tease out and think through in terms of how we actually how we move forward with this. So with the project, we had 2 weeks in Thailand in January where we met government officials, we met grassroots organizations, heritage movements, museum curators, lots of different people, academics as well, to sort of talk about the Thai situation. Next week, we're going to Indonesia and we'll do something similar. And then in 2025, we go to Cambodia. So yeah, it's a really great project. We have the website. I think they showed it, and there's quite a lot of resources on it as well that you can see what we're doing. And and there's like different, there's quite a few blogs on it now as well, actually, where some of them are the sort of self-reflective blogs. Others are more, some of our students at SOAS did research into 3 objects in the British Museum that are of very dubious provenance, and some of them clearly looted and donated by Douglas Latchford. So yeah, there's lots of red flags around them. So yeah, again, it's just a forum for people to raise these issues. So yeah, so that's my present.
Wow.
One of my present projects that nicely, because I focus mainly on Northeast Thailand, and a lot of the looting that took place in Thailand is centered around material from that region. It was a really, really nice way for me to re-engage with Northeast Thailand, but also think, hey, okay, let's not just think about this archaeologically, but let's look at these really important contemporary issues that are happening right now, and how do we how do we engage with it? So yeah, that's what I've been.
Nice. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that you're not working in a very silo way, but really engage with the prevailing issues.
That's a real key term, like silos, right? Don't get into these little like narrow specializations, and so.
Okay. And before we delve into the topics, I must say, Stephen, I've always been intrigued, right? I mean, what drew you to this part of the world, which is quite different from your beginnings in Ireland? How did your interest in the region begin? My goodness, you speak and write fluent Thai.
Okay.
Break it down for us.
My written Thai is okay. My speaking is pretty fluid, but yeah. Okay. I mean, it's funny now looking back because it's been quite a long time, but yeah, I originally I studied at Trinity College Dublin, and I did, like most Europeans, I did Greco-Roman archaeology,
Wow.
so classical archaeology.
That's hardcore.
Which is great. I mean, I absolutely loved it. I mean, I ended up studying like myth, right? And the stuff about Zeus and Hercules and temples and yeah, Troy or whatever. So, it was, great because it sort of explains to you the origins of Western civilization, if you want to bracket it into that sort of box. And sort of where you're coming from culturally yourself and so on and so forth. So I really enjoyed it. I did my 4 years, but at the end of it, I was kind of like, okay, that's interesting. I now know quite a lot about, about Europe, or the Western world. But, Ireland's quite a small place anyway. And I was like, there's a lot more out there, and this was it's kind of pre-internet even, and
Wow.
So, I mean, social media, right? It's a very modern phenomenon. So, back then it was still, I graduated in 1998. And so, you still, I think you could you couldn't even Google things back then. So, if you wanted to find out about the rest of the world.
So you rolled out the world map and say,
Yeah, pretty much. So I had this very simple theory that I was very lucky in my third year. I went on this, they called it the British, what was it? The British School in Athens. It was the British Summer School in Athens. And they took you to all it was 3 weeks where they took you to all the archaeological sites, and it was fantastic. But going to Greece, I was like, wow, this place is very different to, France or Germany or the UK, where I had been a lot, like on holidays as a kid. And so I had this theory that the further east or the further away from Ireland I went, the more interesting and different things would come. So when I graduated, I was like, let's see how far away from Ireland I can get, because surely that'll be really interesting. And I sort of, kind of by accident, kind of half by plan, ended up in Bangkok. And I managed to get a job in a gallery selling sort of restored and antique Chinese furniture, and I did that for 2 years, and it was lots of fun. And that's when I started learning the language as well. I'm a firm believer that that if you really want to understand the culture, you have to understand the language, because when you speak another language, like there's certain concepts, there's certain ways of thinking that are so language specific that if you don't understand the language, you're never going to understand it, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting as well is that when you switch into another language, you then have to respect the social and cultural etiquette, right? So in Thai, there's a lot of social and cultural etiquette.
A lot of it is coded within the language.
And it's coded within the language. And if I'm a foreigner speaking English and I sort of mess up on that, then it's sort of okay. But the minute you switch into the language, like it's not just a language that you're expected to understand, right? So there's different ways of addressing people depending, like any language, there's polite forms and colloquial forms and so on. So for me, that was, I really got interested in that as well. And I think it's a really important point, because we're losing it today with all these, don't get me wrong, I use translation apps as well, because they speed up what I do. But if you lose the ability to speak another language and think in another language, I think you're missing. You're not really ever going to be able to grasp or understand that culture. So that was one reason. And then I was just in Southeast Asia, traveling around all these archaeological sites. I got to Angkor in early 2000 when the airport still was not operational. There was nobody there.
Gosh, it must have been like just as Cambodia was opening up.
Yeah, so it
before.
was just as it was opening up. We had to get you had to get a minivan from Bangkok, and it was funny because when you got in the minivan in Bangkok, it was a nice aircon van, and you're like, okay, fantastic. And then you got to Aranya Pratet Phuiphet border. It took about 2 hours to get there, and then they were like, out you get. And you're like, okay. And you walked across the border and then literally into this, it was like a pickup truck, like a 4x4.
Yeah.
And they just loaded us all in the back. And we spent about another 8 hours driving through dirt roads to get to Angkor. And that's how you had to do it. So it's just sort of hardy backpackers, I suppose.
Yeah.
But that kind of blew my mind, right? I was just,
And you must have seen Angkor without the tourists.
Oh, yeah.
And
I
it's
have
full glory. It's all to yourself.
I think it was my second or third day, and I got to Angkor Wat in the morning, and there was no one there.
My God.
And I climbed up to the top, which now I think even I'm not sure can you do that. I climbed right up to the top, and I walked in, and there was one other person there. I think he might have been a Hong Kong Chinese And the two of us looked at each other and we were just like, wow.
We're survivors.
We were so lucky. And and so just experiences like that. I mean, I went to Sukhothai and Ayutthaya in Thailand and Pimai and all of these amazing archaeological sites. And I was like, wow, like there was people writing about it. Mm-hmm. And of course the Thais, in Thailand, the Thais of a long tradition of archaeological and art historical scholarship, and there's universities there teaching on it. But in terms of like Western scholarship on it or international scholarship on it, there was so little, and I was just so fascinated with this, history that not many people were looking at, and so I always knew I wanted to go back and probably do an MA and a PhD, and then so I was like, right, I've really found an area that I'm really interested in. Right. And then I remember
a deep blue sea.
Yeah, I think so.
Your ocean. So your ocean strategy.
It was and so that's how it started. And then I knew one or two. I'd worked with an archaeologist. During my summers as an undergraduate, I'd worked on these Neolithic burial mounds in France, just near Poitiers, with a Cambridge University, and I think it was University of Niort, maybe it was a French British thing, and I'm pretty sure I wrote a letter because I still didn't really have emails, or maybe it was an early email, and I wrote a letter to this professor, Chris Scarr, and I said, where do I go to do a master's in Southeast Asian archaeology? And someone else had put me in touch with Charles Hyam, who's a very big name in prehistoric archaeology of Thailand. And I think I wrote a letter or emailed him as well. And one or two other people, I think I must have asked my professor back at Trinity, asked everybody the same question, is there anywhere I can go? And they're all just like, SOAS. And so it was like this unanimous kind of, you need to go to SOAS. So I applied and I got into my master's. So then I switched, and that when I went to SOAS, I was the other strong reason to go there was that the only university in the UK and probably one of the only ones in Europe that teach Southeast Asian languages. So I learned Thai more formally there. And then that's how it really began. Yeah, and so it sort of went from there. Yeah.
Gosh, you never take any shortcuts, do you? Yeah.
I mean.
And brings me to my next question. Most curators I know come from an art historical background.
Right.
But you are unique because you come from an archaeological discipline.
I'm going to push back against that. Yeah. I know.
Yeah, and for many of our listeners, I mean, it's quite intriguing to understand what is the role of an archaeologist and how does it measure up to the Hollywood hero Indiana Jones? Yeah,
Indiana Jones is actually like a Tomb Raider, So we actually we discount him. He's blackballed at this point, but I think maybe what it is because of the music. Well, I think there's probably two things going on in Singapore is that they don't teach archaeology here. You can't do a degree in it. So by definition, you're not going to get many Singaporeans trained in it. I mean, of course, John Mixick has done a stalwart job throughout his career of
the lone wolf of Singapore archaeology.
Yeah, and he was in the Southeast Asian Studies department. So, and there's a few people that are trying to take up the mantle. But so I think that's part of it. There's not really there's art history taught here, but to a limited degree. To be honest, a lot of curators originally were archaeologists. So if you think, it depends on the type of museum. So if you think of the British Museum, actually quite a lot of them as well have archaeological background. So if you're in the Greco-Roman department or if you're in the Egyptian department, you're probably, maybe have an archaeology degree. If you're in the Department of Contemporary Art or, of course, then you're not. It would be very strange if you did. But so it's not that there's plenty of archaeologists who are curators. It's just they're in more cultural or a history museum, right? Or a city museum, whatever. A lot of them will have archaeological backgrounds. But yeah, maybe it's a bit more common to have an art historical background because art historians are more what we would say object focused in terms of I think the main difference is for archaeologists, what we're interested in is understanding or reconstructing past cultures, right? So for example, my example, I want to know what's happening in the 7th, 8th, 9th century in Northeast Thailand. And I will use every type of evidence I can get my hands on to build that picture.
Which means going down to ground zero.
Yeah, whether that's sculpture, which is using art historical methods to understand it, or whether it's trying to get pottery records or burials, or looking at architectural remains, or looking at archaeological site plans, looking at inscriptions. So archaeologists, I think, in some ways have a more broader scope. So we will talk about material culture, right? Material or visual culture, and that's what we study. Whereas, and we will be object focused in terms of we do want to look at certain objects and really try and understand them. But the art historical approach is quite different, as in the work of art, quote unquote, is like the starting point usually, right? So I'm interested in this beautiful vessel or this Radhan Sali painting, and I want to understand the painting and maybe the artist who painted it, and then so I'm sort of going to I can do stylistic and I can do formal analysis of the painting, and then maybe if you want to go further than that, I'll start trying to understand the social and cultural context within which that artist was working, right? So I think that's maybe in one way the difference between art historians and archaeologists, but I don't like those hard boundaries either. Like I do both. Yes. And I think if you're I'm a historic archaeologist, as in I do periods that are which we would classify as history because we already have text, image, organized religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. So I have to deal with art, whether I like it or not. Whereas if you do prehistoric archaeology or really early hominid stuff, then you're not really working with art per se. You've only got material to work with. And it's probably similar for art historians. If you're doing modern, contemporary, you're not really going to be thinking about archaeological methods, but if you're doing 14th century Renaissance art or something, you probably should be looking at,
because you've got to get to the origin story.
So I mean, it depends on your approach and there's different theoretical standpoints within the art historical discipline about, about where, how important does the artwork, is it autonomous sort of, can you just study it purely stylistically and, or do you need to understand it within its socio-historical context?
Which increasingly, even a contemporary art world space, you cannot deny its social, cultural context.
So. I mean, that's where, for me, that's where the interest lies as well. I'm usually much more interested in sort of, what the the artwork as a sort of manifestation or a representation of that cultural moment, right?
Yeah.
That to me is much more interesting than talking about its aesthetic beauty or, what type of brushstrokes. I mean, sorry, it's put me to sleep,
And speaking of archaeology, one of your early work with the Nusantara started with this massive 9th century shipwreck found in Belitung Islands of Indonesia,
right?
Not far from Singapore. And it is the flagship collection and exhibition at the Asian Civilisations Museum. You look at it, it's a huge, ambitious undertaking. Tell us, Stephen, what was your role?
Yeah, I was very lucky, and I should say that, there's a lot of people were involved in that. A lot of people involved before I was even involved. But yeah, this is a funny. Okay, I'll tell you an anecdote.
Okay.
So so basically what happened with that collection is, and I don't have time to go into it, but if people are interested in the history of that collection, there's a very good book out by Natalie Pearson, and Belitung Afterlives of a Shipwreck, I think is its full title. And she traces the whole history of it. So if you're interested in really understanding how it ended up in Singapore, I would recommend her work. But to sort of summarize, it was bought in 2005 by Singapore Tourism Board, and finally was transferred over to National Heritage Board in 2013. And there's a lot that happened in between. But I started at ACM. I started on a research fellowship. So I was very lucky. Heidi Tan and Alan Chong and Pedro, what was his name? Pedro Carvalho.
Yeah. The old guys.
They brought me in to research the Bujang Valley material.
Wow, Bujang Valley. Gosh.
So that's how I got to Singapore. And 6 months in, Heidi left, and her position became available, and I interviewed for it, and I became curator for Southeast Asia. And at the time I think that the plans had already been made that ACM was going to go through this revamp. The new gallery was already in its planning stages. And the idea was that the newly transferred over Tang Shipwreck exhibition would go into that space. And to be honest, Heidi had done a lot of work on it, because Heidi Tan, who was the former chief, she was curator for Southeast Asia for many, many years. Started out, she was one of the original crew with Kenson and Gowri and Huisem, and she was, by the time she left, she was like, principal curator or chief curator. But she had really, her and Kenson actually had done a lot of work on that shipwreck, and Heidi's a ceramicist, and so had other people like Alan and Pedro and Shuyi Khan as well. So lots of people had already sort of invested in it. They had been the Smithsonian catalog that had been written, shipwrecked. So there was already this development of scholarship, and then Heidi left to do her PhD at SOAS, and then I think Shuyi left to do her master's, and then basicly I started, and 2 weeks into the job.
It's always like that.
Yeah, so I've been taken on as curator for Southeast Asia, specialize in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. And Alan Chong called me into his office, and he sat me down, and he basically went, "You're an archaeologist." I'm like, yeah. He said, "You're doing 7th to 9th century Southeast Asia." I'm like, "Yep." It's like, "Great. Here you go. You're going to create the Belitung Shipwreck or the Tang Shipwreck."
All 60,000 objects.
Like, okay, but that's full of Chinese ceramics. And he was like, "Yeah, So that was my introduction to it. And it's a good lesson for anybody who wants to get into curatorial work that, you work with the collections that are given to you. But it was I was so fortunate actually, because it's such an amazing collection and you can tell so many amazing stories from it. But it also, it answered so many questions that I was already had about, well, okay, we know that Buddhism and Hinduism was moving into Southeast Asia from probably 5th, 6th century, definitely. But yeah, we know 5th, 6th century for sure, maybe earlier than that. And we know by the 7th, 8th, 9th century, it's really developing. So there's all these, and we know there's all these contacts between China, Southeast Asia, India, maybe even further afield.
Yeah.
But, where's, as an archaeologist, I'm like, yeah, but where's the actual evidence? And then all of a sudden it's like, well, here's a shipwreck that dates to about 830 AD or CE and is clearly trading between the Middle East and China and has sunk
in our waters, in Nusantara waters.
Yeah, which was probably most likely at that point Srivijaya, right? So this really important maritime polity within Southeast Asia. That's one of the centers of Buddhism of the 7th and 9th century world. I mean, it's so important. And so I was like, wow, okay, that really helped me in terms of my of thinking beyond Southeast Asia in terms of what's going on. And so and then I pretty much spent about the next 2 years of my life, I think, studying like that shipwreck, its collection, Changsha bowls, which make up 55,000. Yeah. So I'm quite, now I'm very good at identifying a very narrow band of Chinese ceramics. So if you show me a Changsha ware, I can identify like that, even if it's like a little tiny fragment. I'm like, yep, Changsha.
Having seen 55,000
anything
of it.
else, like don't ask me to identify Northern Song or like whatever, Qingbai or something. Like I'm just like, yeah, whatever, I don't know. But yeah, I'm pretty good with like green, like, UA wares and the white wares. And so it's been really useful because they turn up at all of these archaeological sites in Southeast Asia, particularly in Java, but also Sumatra, even in Thailand, on the stuff that I look at. All of a sudden, I'm like, I know what that is. That's like Chinese tradeware. And wow, okay. So it was really helpful for me in terms of like my scholarship, and I still that's sort of my other main research area is looking at like maritime connectivity and trade networks and so on and so forth. So yeah, and that's been like a lot of fun to work on. So it gave me a sort of, I don't know, it gave me like another area of expertise, which again is also really helpful as a scholar, I suppose.
I think we have a picture of the Tang shipwreck.
Right. So this image was taken by Michael Flecker. So Mike Flecker, who I think most Singaporeans know, of course, is a maritime archaeologist. And this was it before, or just on the surface, I think, before they were excavating it. So you can see.
Yeah.
It's
amazing it survived 1,000
so well
years
intact.
underwater. Yeah. And speaking of, it being found in Belitung Island, in Nusantara waters, not far from Singapore, what does it say about the region being part of this large trading network?
Right.
1,000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's fascinating to me. It's because one thing that, and I think anyone who's a scholar of Southeast Asia, or I think, Southeast Asians themselves are aware of sometimes, is that it sometimes gets relegated but in between India and China, right? And so its importance is downplayed, but actually it's such a vital and key region of the world and always has been. And what the Belitung shipwreck shows are the Tang. So there's two names for it actually. the archaeological convention is to name a shipwreck after the find spot.
Oh.
So that's why it's the Belitung shipwreck.
Right.
And then it got rebranded as the Tang shipwreck when Singapore bought it, which is an interesting decision in and of itself to sort of sinicize it somewhat and downplay the Southeast Asian and also probably Indonesian claim,
right?
Because it was found in. I should clarify. It was found in Indonesian waters, but it was legally salvaged. So it was salvaged under license and sold to Singapore government. And actually, the cargo is split. So about 10% of it is still with the Indonesian Ministry of Marine and Heritage. And they have a very good gallery in their office, so you can go and see parts of the shipwreck there as well.
Okay.
But again, so it is kind of interesting that even when they, Singapore kind of bought it, it was sort of like they weren't quite focusing on the Southeast Asian aspect, which luckily, and in fairness to Alan Chong, one of the reasons why he got me to do it was because he knew if he'd given it to a Chinese curator, they would overemphasize the Chinese aspect, right? The aspect because of the ceramics. And so by giving it to someone who is a Southeast Asianist and that he knew that my take on it would be to situate it within the Southeast Asian region. And that's where I think the story is interesting anyway. So for people who don't know, it had this cargo of about 60,000 ceramics. The ship itself is Middle Eastern. It's that's what's fascinating as well. That was when the groundbreaking finds is that before that, people thought it was like what we call like transshipment, so that ships might sail from the Abbasid Empire and get as far as maybe Palembang or Srivijaya, and then unload their cargo and then
onto the Middle East,
onwards to China, right, and vice versa. So, and that was definitely happening. So there was definitely transshipment happening, just like there is today. Singapore is the largest transshipment port in the world. So. But what the Belitung showed, or the Tang shipwreck showed, is that actually there's direct trade as well. So this ship had sailed all the way from the Abbasid Empire, which is in modern day Iran and Iraq. It's this, high point of Islamic culture and capital is in Baghdad. The major ports would be Basra and at the time it was Siraf. So it probably sailed from Siraf or somewhere close by. Sailed all the way past India, down the Straits of Malacca, would have probably stopped at Palembang and then made its way up to Guangzhou and then Yangzhou, unloaded whatever cargo it had, because we don't know, because that was unloaded and sold, and then picked up this large cargo of Chinese ceramics for its return journey. And it's on its return journey that it sinks in, just off Belitung Island. So its significance really shows that you have this global sort of trade network. It also shows that the Chinese are literally mass producing ceramics at this point. Like they have 60,000 Changsha wares.
And when you look at it, it's still of the design that we use today.
I know. So it's quite amazing. So it sort of raised a lot of interesting points like that. And I think we tried to just really emphasize the role of Southeast Asia within this larger global network. So that was sort of the narrative that we tried to get across.
And produce new knowledge on it.
And then so it's a really interesting and fascinating story. And so of course we have the blue and white.
Yes,
and we can
look at the blue and white because though it looks relatively simple, I mean it resembles contemporary crockery. And can you tell us how such artifacts could reveal the artistic exchange?
So this was one of the surprises on the shipwreck as well, because I think again anyone who knows Chinese ceramic knows that blue and white is the ubiquitous, the sort of the what is it? The sort of leitmotif for the classic Chinese ceramic, right? And it comes from a much later period. It comes from 13th, 14th century onwards. So late I think, right, late Yuan, but the Ming is when it really, you know, you have this beautiful blue and white porcelain that everyone likes to collect. But actually what you see here is that the Chinese were already producing blue and white in the Tang period, so the 9th century. And there was 3 bowls of this kind on the Shipwreck, or 3 dishes, I should say. And what's really fascinating is there's 2 things. First, if you look at the design on it, it's what we call a lozenge and palmette design. That is a Middle Eastern or a Persian motif. That's not a Chinese motif. So straight away you have a Chinese interpretation of this lozenge and palmette design. And then to get the color blue, you need cobalt. And at that period, cobalt was only available in Iran. So what you see here is that they would have had to have shipped the cobalt out to China, to the kilns in China, and then they would have fired this dish, created this dish, and then they were sending it back to the Middle East. So I think like that encapsulates all of these concepts of what we would call globalization, right? So it's movement of raw material, sort of
artistic evolution,
and then shipping it back, you know, from a different manufacturing. So yeah, they're fascinating because you can tell so many. And then of course the white of the actual body of the dish, you can only get that really kind of beautiful white because the Chinese have this specific clay with kaolin in it. And so no other culture could produce this beautiful white ceramic. So you have the white, you have this, even in terms of its materiality, you have this fusion, right? You have Middle Eastern cobalt and Chinese white ceramic. And then when it, in the Abbasid Empire, they're also making dishes like this. So they have the cobalt to hand, but they don't have
the innovation in ceramics, the kaolin.
They don't have the kaolin. Yeah. So they make these sort of earthenware versions and they put a white slip on it, right? So they have to, so you have both. You have both of them sort of interacting with each other and you know.
But this was highly desired for by the Middle Eastern clients.
But this seems to, well, this is the interesting thing. It seems to be like this was like maybe testing the market because there's only 3 of them on it, but it didn't take off. So obviously it didn't,
right.
It for some reason it didn't actually flourish. So we have these three, I should say. And then the Chinese have found a few other fragments in some archaeological sites, like in Yangzhou, but very, very few. So it's really unique. Yeah.
Would you say this is sort of like the prototype for the Ming blue and whites?
I mean, it is and it isn't, right? It shows. So there's this whole debate as well about who came up with blue and white. Was it the Islamic world or was it the Chinese? And my answer is like, I really don't care. And that's being facetious, but actually it's the wrong question to ask, right? Because it just gets petty, like this petty nationalism about like who's the oldest, who's the first, who owns it. We mentioned silos at the start, right? There's no such thing as pure culture, right? And the nationalists out there in every country in the world will get offended for me saying this, but I don't care. The Nigel Farages of this world. But there's no such thing as pure culture, right? It's like every culture is hybrid. It's a mix of so many different elements and aspects. And this really encapsulates it so well, right? That the reason why you have blue and white developing in the Islamic world and you have blue and white developing in China is because of this interaction between these two cultures, right? And everywhere in between.
Yes.
And so that's the interesting story, right? And the question to ask really should be sort of like, is like, wow, how did that happen? And why was it such a popular art form? What is it about the sort of human aesthetic that makes this blue and white like so desirable, right? And sort of how does that show connectivity and sort of cultural hybridity between these different regions? Like that to me is the question to be asking. But there's
And well, coming back to the Nusantara, yes, so this shipwreck that's found here, it's flanked between these two huge empires, but there's also an interesting human story because the
Right.
ships had to be replenished. And there's an interesting story about the crew on board,
Right,
which
right.
mostly came from this part, and why.
Yeah. That's another. So this is one of the things that's hard to get to because as archaeologists, we usually want material remains. But there was no, fortunately, I suppose, there was no bones or skeletons found on board. It sank in very shallow water, so the crew was probably able to swim.
Right.
Swim to land. But yeah, in terms of the crew, they would definitely have been the ship captain, the ship owner, most likely Persian or Arab, because they're the main people who are sailing at this time. So there's another thing that is important at this point. The shipping lanes or maritime trade, the two main cultural groups that are doing it are the Persians and Arabs on one hand, and then the Austronesians, right? So the Southeast Asians. The Indians as well. The Indians were definitely sailing. We definitely have imagery of shipwrecks. We know of shipwrecks as well. But there's certain prohibitions, for example, on Hindus. They were not meant to cross the sea, right? So there's sort of Brahmanical constraints against that, but some of them did. So we know that these cultural groups, but really it's dominated by the Persians, the Arabs, the Southeast Asians. The Chinese were not sailing until about the 11th to 12th century. So they only entered the sort of international arena at that point. Before that, they were, of course, trading in large volumes, but most of the ships were Persian or Southeast Asian.
Because then there's also another trade route, famously known as the overland.
Right. So they were using the overland Silk Road. And again, that's probably transporting silk and lighter objects. If you're going to trade in ceramics, you're not going to put them on camels, right? So there's reasons for that as well. But so we know from the historical sources and from archaeological sources that yes, the two main groups of two or three main cultural groups that are seafarers are the Arabs, Persians, and Southeast Asians. So obviously, if the ship is Persian, so they probably within Southeast Asia pick up
crew and resources.
I mean,
supplies.
These journeys would have taken 6 to 8 months, and
they must be so treacherous.
Brutal, so high rates of attrition as well. So, there's which.
So you really need skilled.
There's this. Where was it? Where was that place on Sentosa that had that maritime shipwreck?
In Sentosa?
What's the museum? They've changed it again now, but it was the Maritime Experiential Museum.
Yeah, along those.
And if you ever went there, they had this sort of short movie where you reenact.
Yeah,
and
the
it
passage.
And it was quite funny because all the actors seemed to be apparently like American Chinese or Korean Chinese actors, and reenacted the passage. And there's all this story there was this romantic story at first about how there was maybe like Singapore Tourism Board sort of promoted it, that there was a princess on board and the gold was a dowry and she was going to be married off to some Arabian prince. And you're like, okay, it's all well and good, but you really think like a Chinese princess is going to like survive like
the passage?
I know. So anyway,
the monsoons.
It was all quite amusing, but I guess it was a good tourism pitch.
Okay.
So.
And talking about relics in this region, I want to discuss your latest project, which seems to be a self-determined exploration. And discovery into new uncharted territory.
This is actually my old project. This is like.
Tell us about your new book.
Yeah, so it's my new book.
Yes.
Which took ages to come out. So basically, this is like based on my PhD research, and then it's like it's like an expansion of what I did for my PhD. So, like I said, when I first started studying Southeast Asia, I went back to SOAS. I'm one of my sort of core interests is how religions spread and move into different regions of the world, and when they do, like what happens? Like what happens to the religion itself? Does it become sort of localized? Does it take on different forms? And what impact does it then have on the cultures that it encounters? So I'm really interested in that cultural encounter between sort of religions and societies, either historically or in the present day.
And this project is amazing because it's even earlier than the great art of Angkor and Borobudur.
Yeah, so I was also, people know it's contemporary with Borobudur, actually. Oh. Yeah. So if that helps people sort of situate it on the timeline, it's earlier than Angkor. So for me, because I'm interested in this early movement, and I guess it's probably goes back to my own heritage being Irish and, sort of as well having Catholicism sort of rammed down our throat. And again, what's interesting is that, like Christianity spreads into Europe at about the same time, it's sort of 5th, 6th century. And so and then, it takes on these different forms, and then it very much determines how we are culturally today. And so I was always, at undergraduate, I studied a lot of history of religion as well. So I always wanted to combine sort of archaeology and history with like history of religion, sort of put the two of them together. I'm not a text person. So, most scholars of religions, they're text-based, right? They read the texts, and it's a very Protestant thing, but it's also probably something that's very familiar for, if you're Islamic as well, is the primacy of the text, right? The word is primary, right? For particularly for Protestant scholars, or people of Protestant faith, but also of Islamic faith, right? That what is said in the Quran or what is said in the Bible, right? This is where, and actually nothing else really matters, right? But for me, I'm much more of a socio-cultural archaeologist, historian. I argue that needs to be situated within larger cultural and historical movements, right? So that's actually my sort of larger interest. And then obviously looking at Southeast Asia, I was very interested in how Buddhism arrived in the region and in Thailand in particular, because I guess from living there, the culture today is so imbued with sort of Buddhist thought, art, archaeology. It's so much part of sort of who they are. Again, very much I sort of felt similar to sort of Irish people with sort of our Catholic heritage, or Christian. So that's why I that was my sort of starting point. And then there's the region of Northeast Thailand, which we can put it up, which would be easier.
To get a sense of its...
it's quite remote, and a lot of people had focused, if you see that part on the left that says Chao Phraya Basin, which is central Thailand, most of the archaeological work had been done there. And then this sort of large region of Isan, or the Khorat Plateau, had sort of been looked at, but not a whole lot of scholarship had been done on it. And so I was really fascinated with what was going on in that region. And it had some very distinctive sort of art forms in terms of these large-scale Buddhist boundary markers or sema stones. And also, if you look at its location, it's in between central Thailand and Cambodia. So it's in between the Angkorian civilization and then these great civilizations of like Sukhothai and Ayutthaya. And I'm like, okay, there's got to be something really interesting happening, within this region. And I'm not the first scholar to look at it by any means. But so actually what was interesting, there's an interesting gap. So you get all of these archaeologists that focus on the prehistory of the region, so looking right back into Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age. And then you get a lot of other scholars looking at the Khmer period. So the Khmer Empire moves into the region by about the 10th century. But then there's this gap of about 300 years, 400 years where nobody was looking at. And I'm like, well, what's going on there? That's surely when all the interesting things are happening. So what I did, if you can see on this image, is it's a very classic archaeological approach. And this is, again, where we would differ very, very much from our historians, is I did an archaeological survey. So I basically went around and I visited all of those dots on the map. There's over 110 sites. It took me over a year. A lot of very remote locations and villages. And I was on a shoestring budget as well, because, academics don't get, particularly PhD students, don't get funded much to do this type of thing. And then I plotted where everything was, and then I start trying to look at different patterns from the data.
Wow.
But even just from doing that, the literature up that point said, maybe there's 10 or 20 sites. And I documented 110, and there's more being discovered even since then. So just from sort of quantity or quantitative data alone, you can make a very strong argument that something is really happening here.
And it was emergent from the art.
Yeah, it's art and the art, but also the archaeological sites and the architecture. I combine all of them.
Yeah, we can have a look at the archaeological site as well.
This is probably one of the key archaeological sites. It's called Mung Faded. It's in Galveston province. It's right in the center. The image you see in front of you is a stupa, right? Or that probably most people are familiar with. What's interesting again is that the superstructure is later. It's probably 15th, 16th century, but the base is 7th to 9th century. And then around it, you can see these stones, these sema stones, which are still in use today in Buddhist practice. You have to, in order to do certain rituals, like the ordination ceremony, you have to create a boundary, like a ritual boundary. And these sema stones were used to do that. So I basically did a survey of them. And so where you find these sema stones, then you know that there's a functioning Buddhist community, right? Because of the remnants. So that's sometimes all that survives. So I was able to sort of reconstruct sort of where there was Buddhist practice, where there was Buddhist monasteries. I'd also try and combine that with the archaeological record. So looking at where do we find these large moated sites that are obviously habitation sites. And then sometimes we have architecture. So we can try and tie all this information together to try and build up a picture of what was happening in the region, in the 7th to 11th centuries. So that's what I did. And then in my thesis, I focused specifically on the sema stones. And then as I was going around the region, I realized, okay, there's more going on than just these Buddhist boundary markers. There's all these other types of Buddhist evidence as well. But I didn't have enough. That was beyond the scope of my thesis. And so then once I finished that, I gradually started expanding and writing this book to
encapsulate.
To sort of a bigger picture again of what's happening and
help to map it out.
And so it eventually came out just this year. So it's funny because I've maybe because of the trajectory of my career, if I'd finished my PhD and gone straight into an academic job, then I would have gone straight into this upgraded version of my thesis. It was sort of a normal academic thing to do. But when I finished, I was very lucky. I got 2 years at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and then at ACM. So that, in museums, what's really important, you sort of live and die by your exhibitions, right? And you got to get catalogs out, and you got to do all this. Getting an academic publication out is not as important. So, and I didn't mind that. That was fine. So I switched kind of. But I was always working on this in the background. And then once I got the academic post at SOAS, I was like, right, I got to get it done. I just got to get it out and get it published. And I was very lucky that we have this.
It's by NUS Press.
Yes, by NUS Press. And we have this is the third in the series. So we have this Hindu Buddhist, I should read out the full title. Please. And even, it's always so long, I forget. So it's the Southeast Asian Art Academic Program, which is funded by the Alphawood Foundation. That also funds my post is an endowed post. So it provides a lot of scholarships for Southeast Asian nationals to come study at SOAS. So there's been quite a few Singaporean recipients. So again, if anybody's listening to this podcast and are interested, do look on our website or contact me, and we're happy to talk to you about it, because there's a few more rounds coming up where you can either come and do a diploma in Asian art or a master's in Asian art. So it's a really great opportunity. It's really helped build up, a strong cohort of scholars in the region, but it also it funds different research projects, and this is one. And so we teamed up with NUS Press. It's run by my colleague Ashley Thompson. She's the head editor of this. And this is the third. The first was called Returning Southeast Asia's Past by Panga Ardiansa, a Indonesian scholar, and Louise Titakot. The second was by Ashley Thompson. It's an edited volume on early Theravada in Cambodia. And then this one's on Thailand. And then the next one will be on Indonesian bronzes.
Amazing.
So it's a really...
So it's quite long. It has a long-term view. And,
hopefully, yeah. So we definitely have, this one, mine's just come out, and there's another one happening. Hopefully it will continue after that as well. And really...
help to build a holistic picture.
Build a really sort of strong, we hope, sort of comprehensive
overview,
updated view of Southeast Asian art and archaeology. So I was very lucky that I had that opportunity to publish with them. Yeah, and there's one reason why I'm here in Singapore to promote it. And it's been great.
And as I always say, art history starts here.
Yeah, art history, archaeology. I think I put both in, art and archaeology. I wanted to probably say archaeology and art, but art always snappier, so it goes first.
And one of the most striking artifacts from your discoveries is the Sarabanga Jataka.
Right.
Please tell us what it's about.
Call it up on the screen. This Sema stone is really quite unique because it's sort
exquisite.
The carving is fantastic. Yeah. This is kept at the local temple at Mung Faded, the local temple of what Po Sema, I think it's called. And it's exquisitely carved. So again, you can see, at this point, the level of artistic excellence that they're reaching. This is not... this is not some small little
it's not.
Outpost, right? This is a major civilization or culture. So that's one of the arguments, I try to make through looking at art, right? Or a production of art. You can make certain assumptions. What's really curious about this one actually is that the top 3/4 is actually, it's the life of the Buddha, right? So the Jatakas are the past life of the Buddha. So in Buddhist belief, particularly in the Pali Canon or the Theravada tradition, he's reincarnated 547 times, right? So each time he's reincarnated, he gets a little bit closer to enlightenment. So he perfects himself a bit more each time. And it's when he reaches enlightenment, that moment that you see here, well, maybe not actually here is probably slightly different, but the moment he reaches enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he can then remember all of his past lives. So it's like this moment. And so that's the tradition, right? That as you gain good merit in each life, then you get reborn and closer. So that's the Theravada way of getting to
nirvana.
Yeah, which is takes a long time, right? It's the what is it, like the easy slow living as we call it today, like whereas the tantric way is like the kind of
super highway,
like the kind of modern social media age. I'm going to hack the system, right? I'm going to hack the system.
Get the cheat codes.
Yeah, get the cheat codes and just going to get spontaneously enlightened. And Mahayana is sort of somewhere in between. Right. But Mahayana is the idea that everybody has a bodhisattva nature within them, or everybody has like Buddha nature within them and can become enlightened. But what's interesting about about these depictions is, so in most of them, they actually just show the Jataka tail itself. Whereas in this one, it's the Buddha seated cross-legged, and you can identify it's him because he's at the highest point in the narrative. There's the Bodhi tree behind him, and he's flanked by the fans, which is, another sign. And then there's these individuals listening to him below. And in a lot of the tellings if you read the Pali Jatakas, and they've been translated into English, at the start of each Jataka tale, it usually starts with the Buddha, and the Buddha is saying to his followers, I am now going to tell you about this life or that life. And so it looks like maybe that's what's happening in this scene, is that the top part of it is the Buddha telling his followers, I'm going to recount to you one of my past lives. And so it's really unique. And then what actually the Sarabanga Jataka is the three figures at the bottom. And there's a story about, and the Buddha's the one in the middle, where there's these two archers and they're shooting arrows at him, and he manages to sort of jump in the air and I think strike down the arrow.
Arrows.
Yeah. So it's very unusual in that sense, is what we call a conflated narrative. It shows like two different episodes in one scene. But yeah, it's just a beautiful,
indeed it is,
beautiful work of art. So,
and survived the test of time.
Yeah, which is also quite amazing because the sandstone is quite friable. You can see some of it as, But the local temple of actually now I visited in January, and you see that step. That step is an altar. So they would place offerings on it.
Okay.
And they concreted it in so it didn't get stolen, right?
Okay.
But now somebody removed that step, so you can actually see the bottom half of the. Yeah, and I think I have a photo of it from when I went. But when the image in the book, of course, I took that I took in 2010, I think. But yeah, it's still in very good condition. So it's still there at the temple.
Nice. And there's also another striking piece right here, the Buddhist art carved into natural rock.
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why when I was doing my thesis, I was just focusing on the Sima, these Buddhist boundary markers. But then I started seeing all these other things like this. And I was like, wow, this is really fascinating.
How does this even survive our tropical conditions of high rainfall and
it's sort of
hot sun?
Excuse me, it's sort of in an overhang.
Okay.
It is like the rock. It's set back, and there's a So they knew what they were doing. And there's a few of these. Colloquially they're called sleeping Buddhas. Yeah. But the technical term is, Mahaparinirvana, which means the moment the Buddha passes away and enters nirvana. So it's like the end of his life cycle, right? So in a lot of Buddhist art, they show the different cycles of the Buddha's life. So it can be his birth, which is the dream of Queen Mara Queen Maya and the elephant. There's his first steps. Sometimes in the Chinese tradition, I think he's holding up his finger. Of course, there's his meditating on the Bodhi tree is the moment of enlightenment.
That precipice of reaching enlightenment.
Yeah, and then there's the fight with Mara and so on and so forth. And this is the final episode, right? This is when he's about 80 years old, and he lies down, and it's like the cessation of being, right? He enters into nirvana. So it's this key moment. And for some reason, at this point in time in the Khorat Plateau, you start to get a number of these images carved into very remote rock faces. Right. So I got quite fascinated by that as well. And this seems to be a pilgrimage site. So it seems that, so I walked up to this in 2014 myself and my two Thai colleagues, Tanansak Hanwang and his wife Lalita. Myself and Lalita did our PhDs together in SOAS. She's a historian of Burma. She's Thai, but she studies Burmese politics, and she teaches in Gasetsat University. But when we both finished, she moved back to Northeast Thailand, and she met Tanunsak, who's an archaeologist as well. And then she was like, "You got to meet my husband because you both do like Northeast Thai archaeology." So I was like, "Okay, actually, I need to get to this really remote archaeological site at the top of a mountain. You guys want to come with me?" And they were like, "Yeah." And then like we got there, it was like really humid, rain. It didn't.
Must be hard.
It was hard, and it was.
Because the locals might not even know.
So luckily, there's you can see there's offerings. So there's a few monks that still live there, and the monks saw us and actually led us up the path. It took us about 45 minutes to an hour, and we were like panting.
Yeah.
By the time we got to the top, we were like covered in sweat, and but it gives you a very good understanding of why they chose that location, right? For be a pilgrimage site. There's also the forest monk tradition, which is still
forest monk tradition. Yeah. Please tell us more.
So the forest monk tradition, which saw a sort of a renaissance in Thailand in the mid 50s onwards, but it's always been there. So the Buddhist principles obviously is that, a Buddhist monk should withdraw from society, meditate and try and reach enlightenment, right? So, but at the same time, there's this sort of interesting paradox within Buddhism that in order for monks to do that, they need support from society, right? Society has to donate to them, has to sustain them. And so what you get. Actually, what's interesting is in India with early Buddhist monasteries, a lot of them are outside of the cities and they're in these quite remote locations, but they're also located on trade routes. So they are still, getting quite a lot of traction and patronage. And then so one thing I was trying to figure out as well was by looking at where you find this archaeological material, can you say, what type of Buddhism is happening? So most of it is located in these major urban settlements that you'd expect. But these sites seem to suggest that there's also maybe a tradition of forest monks happening so the forest monks, some of them sort of consciously reject that more urbanized form and then just go off. Some of them just go off and live in forests by themselves, and it's really a real aesthetic lifestyle. But now there's also forest monk temples where you might get a group of monks that so much more meditative, much more sort of reclusive form. So yeah, it looks like that's maybe what's happening there, that you have even at that early period. And a lot of the time they use caves and this type of natural rock shelters to do that practice. It's very common in Sri Lanka as well. Burma has a very strong tradition of it. Cambodia, as well. Not sure about the Mahayana Chinese traditions. I'm not as sure, but I'm sure it's there as well. But and there's some very sort of well-known Thai monks that practice it.
Sites of veneration within nature as
well,
that survive thousands of years.
Right, and that's sort of the title of the book, sort of Buddhist Landscapes. So this idea of imprinting Buddhism not just physically but cognitively onto the landscape. So maybe the idea is that when people see that mountain, they know the Buddha image, right? The moment of nirvana is, and so this landscape becomes integral to it. So
which reminds me of when you go to Borobudur and at the highest level you look across, you see the mountain range that looks like the sleeping Buddha.
That's true, and in Borobudur as well, as you go up, you're going up to the different levels of human existence, and then up to these different levels of existence till you get to the top, and that's the moment of enlightenment. Yeah. So people have said that as well. Maybe with these mountaintop sites, that's why, because it's like maybe as you walk up and do your pilgrimage, it's sort of taking that journey up through the Tribhumi and Thai, the three worlds. So there's lots of interesting comparisons, and exactly this is exactly the same time as Borobudur. That image there's an inscription at the bottom of it as well, so it's dated to about the 8th to 9th century. Wow. So right in the same, and that's getting
Wondering
back to
what was happening
I know,
back
and that's
then,
getting
yeah.
back to the Belitung
Yes.
shipwreck. That's why it's so fascinating. That ship sailed in 830, 840. I think Borobudur, they say, was built, in 812,
Yes.
820?
And you can't build that without resourcing
Exactly.
and patronage.
So it's exactly the same time.
What was happening?
Yeah, lots was happening. Yeah. So there's lots of trade and activity.
Lots
and,
of new capital coming through, and And
so yeah, the idea that Southeast Asia was like a backwater is just ridiculous. It's like.
So how did the Buddhist landscape of the Khorat Plateau important to our understanding of early artistic production in the region and also applicable to the Nusantara?
The Nusantara, I don't know. That may be a bit of a stretch, but I think maybe like what we've just said, right? That you can look at what's happening in
comparatively in the neighborhood.
You can look at Bujang Valley.
Yes.
You can look at all these places, and you can look at central Thailand, northeast Thailand, and you can see that at this period of sort of 7th, 8th, 9th century, you're just getting this like ground swelling of primarily Buddhist, but also then in Cambodia, of course, it's mainly Hindu or Shaivite and Vaishnavite. So, but either way, you're getting this. It's this huge moment of sort of civilizational blossoming, if you want to use sort of grand terms for it, and it's all interconnected, right?
Yeah.
They don't exist in isolation. We know that all these monks are traveling around, like whether they're the Chinese monks. I'm sure there were Southeast Asian monks like circulating as well. We just don't have the clear. We have some evidence for it, but so it's just really like quite a fascinating cultural moment, and that's why I got so interested in like 7th, 8th, 9th century because it's like wow, like this is everything's happening, everything's kind of kicking off, right? Yeah, you got Borobudur, which is the largest Buddhist monument in the world,
right in our neighborhood,
and then you have the Belitung or the Tang shipwreck.
Yes.
Then you have things like in central Thailand where you and the Khorat Plateau where you have all this sort of Buddhism happening. Then in Cambodia you have the Angkor, right? So it's not Angkor yet, but by 802 it is, right? So 802 is CE is the founding of the Angkor Empire. So again, it's right at that period, right? It's like right at the same time as they're building Borobudur, and the Tang shipwreck is sailing through, and this is happening on the Khorat Plateau. You have Jayavarman II up on Phnom Kulen in the city of Mahendraparvata, which is now we know from LiDAR is much more extensive than we ever realized. So Damien Evans, who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago or last year, who's an Australian scholar, did a lot of the LiDAR work, pioneering LiDAR work in Cambodia, revealing that as well. So we know that that's happening. And then, of course, they move down into where Angkor is and start setting up all these other temples. So, in the 9th century, you have just like...
people are very
mobile and all of these very important cultures. And then, of course, Angkor becomes like the largest city, like one of the largest cities in the world when it's at its peak. I think the only comparisons are Baghdad, which is again the heart of the Abbasid Empire, and Tang, China, right? So, it's past or China at that point, which what would it be like Ming, late Song or Ming, early Ming, where you have like Cha'an or Xi'an.
Yes.
So you have these sort of 2 or 3 mega capitals, maybe some places in India as well under the Cholas, but yeah, like, so it really underscores like how important the region is. But so that's sort of why what I'm interested in as well is just trying to sort of bring out that importance of Southeast Asia, and I'm more interested in that sort of nascent period of sort of 7th, 8th, 9th century when it's starting, right? When it's really kicking off. And then other scholars, I guess, focus more on the sort of maybe 10th, 11th, 12th. And of course, by the 12th, 13th century in Nusantara, then you have Majapahit, right? Which is this other major like
empire
player, right? That's
power seat.
So and then you have, I mean, what's interesting there then, of course, is then you start to see then the movement of Islam into the region, and then how that also plays out, which is another really fascinating aspect. So yeah, that sort of situates my book within a much larger cultural and historical setting. But also maybe just the final word on it is I think, from what I gave a lecture, one or two lectures in Thailand last week as well, where I kind of went much more in detail. And even in Thailand, the sort of northeast Thailand or central Laos, the Khorat Plateau, they'd sort of be like, yeah, we know things are happening there, but they sort of talk about it quite generally. And what I really try and show in this book is that if you really do the sort of hard archaeological work and really like
walk the field,
and
walk
really
the
sort of
ground,
build up all this data, you can really start to really like get specific, right? You can really specifically look at different areas within that region and start to talk in much more detail about what's actually happening, and sort of give it much more of an identity, I feel. So that's sort of what I try to do, try to make it much more concrete. I guess, that's where academia, sometimes it's just good to go really deep and narrow and be able to do that, but also understand it within this wider cultural sphere or wider cultural movements that's happening. So,
well, thank you, Stephen, for putting in the hard work. I mean, now we have a point of reference, very conveniently in a book. We don't have to take 6 months off and walk through the remote sites.
I would definitely recommend it. I have one or two people that contacted me,
Nice.
And said, "Oh, we want to go," and I told them some sites to go to, and then I was really impressed. I was like, "Wow, you went to all of that?" It's like, I'm like, "You're just doing this for fun?" It's like, wow. But I would hardly recommend it if people are in Thailand. That some of the sites are really accessible. Go spend some time in Northeast Thailand. Go see some of the sites. They're really fascinating. You don't need to go see all 110 of them, but
and like your time in Angkor, just have it all to yourself.
If you go to these sites, won't see many tourists, which is nice as well, because you'll get a more
undisturbed.
Yeah, maybe more undisturbed, and you'll be more welcomed, I suppose.
Well, Stephen, we cannot have a conversation about the Nusantara without discussing your seminal exhibition, Raffles in Southeast Asia.
Right? That's why I said, sorry, I gotta go.
Just a few questions.
All right.
Yeah. So this exhibition coincided with the bicentennial celebrations.
Right.
Yes, tell us what you aim to do with this show as one of the 3 curators.
What did I aim to do? Yeah, I mean, this was an interesting one because, again, this is maybe another cautionary tale to anybody who wants to become a curator. As I think hopefully is clear now, I'm not an expert in 19th century Southeast Asian colonial engagements, nor am I like an expert in Malay world, particularly sort of Islamic or so on. So for me, this came about because, as you say, the bicentennial was happening, and as a lot of things in Singapore, it sort of was on a very tight schedule.
Usually is, yeah.
It kind of happened last minute, and so we had 9 months to get it together, and so I was asked just to sort of step in and help sort of like oversee it. And so in this I focus more on the Hindu and Buddhist material, because that's again where my strengths are. So I mainly worked on that side of the exhibition. The exhibition, of course, is with the British Museum and with a colleague of mine, Dr. Alexandra Green, and Naomi Wang, who's, of course, the Southeast Asian curator at the ACM. So the three of us did it. And actually what happened was that Alex Green was already... so for people who don't know, essentially... what survives of Raffles' collection, which is not much, because I think most people know that it all went up in flames in the Fame in 1824. But the material that he collected when he was Lieutenant Governor of Java, so that's between 1811 and 1815, 1816, that he sent back. As far as I understand, I think he probably
I think
sent...
we have a photo of the mamaki, right?
Yeah,
from the
exactly.
British Museum. Let's see. No, the mamaki is the
stone
sculpture. Sorry, we're just jumping through.
That
yes,
one,
yeah.
yeah. So he, he visited Borobudur, and he incorrectly is credited with discovering it. This is he's one of a list of people that get a list of colonial white men that claim things that don't belong to them. But if you're smart enough to publish first and stick your name out, people give you credit. But Borobudur was never lost. I mean, so it was never lost. The Javanese sultans still knew it was there. People still worshipped at it before, and even the Dutch had already
knew of it.
Already knew about it and done surveys of it. So Raffles, which is quite a...
He needed to fulfill his KPI.
Yeah, definitely. He was a complete career animal, complete self-promotionalist, There's plenty of modern day parallels right now. But anyway, we won't go there. But what's interesting is he collects up these three pieces of sculpture, but he collected up a lot of wayang, kulit, and textiles, and sort of a lot of ethnographic material, and that got sent to the British Museum.
Right.
Well, incorrect. Actually, after he passed away, his wife and his uncle, I think, tried to first sell it to the British Museum. They said they didn't want it. And then eventually they donated it by about 1834, I think. Is that right? I'd have to check the dates. But essentially it ended up in the British Museum. And Alex, and nobody really looked at it. So it got displayed briefly for a number of years. And then again, it sort of shows the disregard that Britain had for Southeast Asia, right? They sort of wax lyrical about India and China maybe, and Egypt and places, but they really didn't have a very high view of they didn't understand it either. But anyway, it gets put in storage, never really analyzed. And Alex, in fairness to her, really started to research this material in depth. And was the first person to really do it. There had been, there'd been a show in Singapore, I think 10 years prior, and Nigel Barley, who was, I think, at the British Museum's anthropologist, had done work in it. So people had done working on it, but not really intensively. So Alex had planned this show, and it just so happened that then, of course, with the Singapore bicentennial happening, ACM or NHB were interested in doing something as well. And so this collaboration formed between us and the British Museum, and so we said, right, let's join up, and then we can do the exhibition in ACM, and then
it traveled to British Museum.
And so Alex really, Alex's research is really at the core of this, and I think if you read the catalog, you see her really meticulous detailing of the collection and what's actually in there. So I think the catalog is really useful in that sense, because it's the sort of first proper thorough catalog. So if people actually want to know what's in the collection, they can look at it. And then we also wanted to borrow material from Indonesia to really sort of de-emphasize the sort of British colonial aspect and sort of have that Indonesian voice in there. So that's why we brought in some of the Majapahit.
Oh, we have this
really beautiful
princess, the
stone.
Oh,
yeah.
gosh.
So this piece that, is from the National Museum Jakarta.
Sarasvati.
That's really, just again, just to really sort of, to try and, again, to sort of get away from that colonial narrative that, I mean, Raffles was interesting. He was making this, he had vested interests, because if you know of the history of the region, basically Java was under the Dutch.
Yep.
And then during the Napoleonic Wars, Holland or Netherlands fell to Napoleon under the French. So then actually all of the Dutch colonies became French possessions.
Yes.
And so the British were at war with the French. And then that gave them actually, so they were able to, the East India Company were able to, under the pretense of of war, able to actually, take Java. Because, the British are always like sniffing around and trying to take what they can by any sort of nefarious means possible. Like they did with Singapore, maybe. But anyway, so Raffles is installed as lieutenant governor, but he knows that, once the Napoleonic Wars are over, that if the British win, which of course with the British and the Prussians, Battle of Waterloo and all that, that when they win, that then of course they'll have to give Java back to the Dutch. No, God forbid they give it back to the actual Javanese, right? That wasn't even on the cards, of course. The sort of colonial arrogance of the time, really, and the sort of just, want to sort of asset strip Java, really. But yeah, so he tries to make this case to show that Java, somewhere that the British Empire should keep. And one of the ways he does this is show that, it's this very sophisticated
material culture.
Hindu Buddhist culture, doesn't talk about Islam because, they have this very derogatory colonial view that Islamic culture is sort of, is despotic and all this thing. But that's why these objects, they're in his history of Java. So we wanted to sort of bring them in to sort of try and get that Indonesian angle in, or at least to sort of get more of that into it. So that's sort of it. And then, of course, there's a part on the sort of Singapore connection that Naomi Wang worked much more on.
Which brings me to my next question, because one of the most outstanding collections is this royal regalia of the Johor Riau Lingga,
Johor Riau Lingga,
Sultan.
right?
Gosh.
Which is at the National Museum Jakarta today.
And shown for the first time in Asia through this show.
No, I don't think so. Okay. I think it's always been on display in the National Museum Jakarta. So, which is interesting because so we tried to sort of get to maybe this is where things get tricky when you're a curator. When you're a curator and when you're not a history museum, right? When you're an art museum or an archaeological museum, and you need to tell stories or history through objects, right? So trying to get to a deeper understanding of how, say, Raffles and the British managed to sign the treaty, the 1819 treaty with Hussein Shah. And of course, what the British did was they inserted themselves, as usual, into a succession. Plans, they'd already done this, I think, with getting Penang, right? I think, and Johor with Penang, I think, Kedah. So they're very good at like sort of dividing and conquering. So playing sort of one claimant off against the other, and the Dutch did the same thing, of course. So of course, Raffles is in Bencoolen at this point, and in 1819, and this is basically a hardship posting, or what would you call it? It's a lateral promotion. Because he came back. Actually, what people don't realize is that he came back from Java, from his governorship of Java, and he was. While he managed to again self-promote and celebrate himself through his scholarship, his history of Java, the East India Company had a different view of him. So there'd been a sort of dodgy land deal where it's kind of classic where I think the government they auctioned off land and then he bought it, right? This type of thing. There was other very problematic things that he'd done, of course, in terms of Palembang and the massacre that took place there. So there's all this sort of thing swirling around about him. And they just basically didn't want to give him another posting. And they said, right, you can have Bengkulu if you want, which was at that time like
pretty remote.
Yeah, pretty remote and not an important posting in the scheme of things.
Yeah.
So he went there with his second wife and his 4 kids. 3 of them died from malaria, I think. So, I mean, it kind of shows what, the sort of ruthlessness of him, that he would sort of take his family there when they were young children. And even though even after the first one died, he didn't, he stuck it out. So yeah, he was quite a obstinate character. But that, the whole thing, of course, at that period was that the Dutch and the British were vying for control of the Straits of Malacca and so on, and this trade route to China. And so they were trying to find, the Dutch had already taken basically the Johor, the Riau Lingga Sultanate, and they had a base, I think in, Bintan or Batan, where we went. And so, you have Farquhar and Raffles and a few others surveying the region, and they identify Singapore, but then of course it's technically under Dutch, right? The Dutch claim it. So Raffles, of course, inserts himself into this succession dispute and signs the treaty with Hussein Shah. I don't need to explain it to Singaporean viewers, but. So that's why we brought in this regalia to try and show that actually we brought it in as well to counter the narrative. So the British narrative, but also the Singapore narrative, the old Singapore narrative that Singapore was just a sleepy fishing village and nothing was happening here and basically the Johor Riau Lingga Islands, of which Singapore is a part, right, were just this backwater that was the British narrative, right, that justifies them taking it, right.
But then,
and so we tried to show this to say, no, look, if you look at this sort of artistic production and if you look at what's actually happening in this region, how can you call it a backwater? Because this is ridiculous, right? So that was our idea. I guess it didn't come across in the show clearly that maybe that's why we were doing it. I think certain people didn't like the fact that, so there's a dispute as well, right? There's what we might call internal colonization. So within Indonesia, this is now this material is on display at National Museum Jakarta.
Right.
But it belongs, of course, to the Sultan, the Johor Riau Lingga Sultan. So Johor, of course, today is part of Malaysia. But this material, of course, is the pusaka or the heirlooms of the last Sultan of the Riau Lingga Sultanate, which is today, of course, just across the bay or just across the strait in modern day Indonesia. So, there's a sort of, within Indonesia, they're like, why is this on display in Java and not on display in a museum, in region, right? So there's sort of political tensions there as well. So then having it on display in Singapore, I suppose, but I guess for us, we were like, well, this was part of the Johor Riau Lingga Sultanate, and this was actually the regalia you needed to be the Sultan of it. But I suppose it's a very sensitive, it's still a very sensitive topic, right? And when you display it like this, yes, I understand that the museum aesthetic can sort of fossilize things or sort of make them look like dead objects. So and there's probably needed to be more of a critical text or a critical sort of dialogue on that. So I think that's sort of maybe where the exhibition fell short in certain respects, but I still think it was important that we brought it and then it highlights it anyway, right? And that people
because
are
this
there.
story is not really
Not known, and sometimes a bit of controversy is a good thing because actually it gets things noticed, which otherwise people wouldn't really have noticed it. So it's a complicated story. I'm not the I'm by far not an expert in this, but I guess from my perspective, I'm interested in that sort of colonial encounter. I'm very interested in how and then how the sort of,
Yeah. And an interesting story behind this was that the Dutch try to, because it is symbolic of
So
kingship.
the Dutch retained it, right?
Yes, they try to take it away from the Queen, Raja Hamida. And interestingly, Stephen, we actually took a trip to Bintan.
We did.
To go and visit the makam of the royal family, and we can see that photo there. It was. This is, of course, the photo of the last one, right here, go. Raja Ali. And there's a photo of you at the tombstone of Raja Hamida, the Queen. Yeah. This, I think, the next one. Yeah, right there. That's you in the...
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating. I think
this is quite an archaeological experience for us at the museum with you.
Yeah, I think probably like in hindsight, if we it's one of those funny things about modern national borders, right? That we have this border between Singapore and then these islands, but of course we hopped on a boat and we were there in 1 hour. And so culturally, right? So I don't need to explain it, but the British and the Dutch carved up the region, and as usual with colonialism. It split these regions that are culturally connected, right? So you have, like the islands of Sumatra, and then you have the Malay Peninsula, which are sort of culturally connected. And then, of course, Singapore is
with the Riau Lingga region.
Was, of course, first part of the Strait settlements or the Federated Malay States, the Strait settlements, and so on, the British control, and then these islands, Bintan, Batam, become under the Dutch, but actually, they're culturally Johor. It was called, Johor Riau Lingga Sultanate, which Singapore was a part of. So I think when we went over there and sort of geographically, and within this sort of, like Leonard Andaya talks about seascapes, right? And you have to understand the region from, like Nusantara, it's the land below the waves, right? Yeah. You have to understand it from this vantage point of the sea.
Yes.
And once you do that, then it becomes much clearer. And I think that's what, when we went there, I think, and I think it is quite poignant. And it felt like somewhat tragic as well, that so that you have this sultanate that was split. Yeah. And like you say, the Dutch were very clever. Yeah. They knew that you needed those pusaka to
kind of claim take away your kinship symbolically.
Coronation ceremony, right? So you can't ordain or coronate a new sultan. And I think that's why they were in Jakarta. I think the Dutch took them took
them back, and then it was returned to...
I can't quite remember the full story, but so it is this, actually, the sort of, these sites are so important for sort of Singapore history as well, but they kind of get, because of modern geopolitics, maybe they kind of get sort of put to one side and not really discussed, right? But they're fascinating cultural and historic sites. So yeah, I think looking back on it it was good that we did it, but maybe there was. Yeah, maybe under the political framework we were operating in, it's the best we could do. But we couldn't really. It
was a nice field trip.
Yeah. But anyway.
To Bintan, yeah. So yes, thank you, Stephen, for breaking it down for us.
Sure.
Art, archaeology, and the Nusantara.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. Lots of fun.
Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to this episode of Norse Nusantara. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to this podcast to hear more from leading thinkers and creators on picturing the Nusantara.